So recording is starting now. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us again to UCREL, and I'm very happy to have with me today Luke and Zsofia. So I'm not going to hesitate here, just whenever you're ready, please do start.
All right, I shall start by trying to share my slides. Can you see a presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for inviting us, Chloe, to UCREL. I should say right from the beginning that I'm very lucky to have Luke Collins with me today, because although I use corpus linguistics a lot, I'm not a corpus linguist as such. So when I'm talking to an audience like UCREL, I always feel woefully underprepared. But Luke will be delivering the corpus linguistics-y bits, so I feel much safer in his hands. As that demonstrates, I work a lot with Lancaster University, so you will be seeing a lot of names that you'll probably be familiar with dotted throughout this presentation. This is a talk on the basis of a joint project between UCL, Lancaster University, and also Durham University. So we have contributors to different parts of the talk from all over, obviously including Elena Cimino and Luke Collins, but also Jonathan Culpepper, and indeed the Hearing the Voice team at Durham University, who kindly supplied us with the data that we'll be looking at today. So that much for an introduction. Today we'll be talking about finding and analyzing reported speech in interviews with clinical voice hearers, with a focus specifically on instances of impoliteness and politeness, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on exactly what I mean by that. It's an odd context for linguistic analysis in a number of ways. We don't generally tend to do a lot of sort of politeness, impoliteness analysis on reported speech, and then reported speech in the context of voice hearing is another level. And it makes it very interesting to try and apply some of the linguistic frameworks that we've developed in other contexts and to see where they work and where they might need to be stretched. So I'll be telling you a little bit about the context. What is voice hearing? What is psychosis? And why reported speech matters in that context. I'm going to assume some level of knowledge about frameworks of politeness and impoliteness, but I will give sort of definitions and specify exactly what type of analysis in this sense we're talking about. I will then hand over to Luke Collins, who will talk about the methods, in particular on finding reported speech using corpus methods. And then I'll say a little bit, just very briefly, on how we coded for politeness and impoliteness. And I'll give you some headline findings. This is still work in progress. We haven't published it yet. And so I'll give you some headlines, some of which ties into previous work, and then bits and pieces of news where we're still working out the pragmatic sides. And we'll end on some reflection on pretty much on why all of this matters. Hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. And again, I note I had a look at some of the previous UCREL presentations. This will be a lot less technical and much more applied and sort of thinking about the implications within the context of psychosis and perhaps the treatment of psychosis and voice hearing where that is desirable. So I've mentioned voice hearing and psychosis before. Let's actually have a look at what that is. Basically, hearing voices is also sometimes referred to as auditory verbal hallucinations, although that term is controversial because hallucinations suggest that it's not real. Either way, it involves the perception of verbal content in the absence of an appropriate external stimulus. So people can hear voices that others around them would not be able to hear. Now, voice hearing is described often as a characteristic symptom of schizophrenia spectrum disorders, including psychosis. But voice hearers don't necessarily have mental health problems. And in fact, about 10% of the general population, although the percentages vary, but about 10% of the general population hears voices or has experiences of this sort at one point or another in their lives. And even among the population that's considered clinical, so people who've entered mental health services and have clinical diagnosis such as schizophrenia, a sizable minority of these people do not find these experiences distressing. And this is partly because distress isn't linked to the mere presence of voices. So this idea that you're hearing something that others can't hear isn't necessarily distressing in itself. Rather, distress is linked to the perception of control, or the lack of it, that one has over these experiences, and by extension, the relative power that one has in relation to these voices. And reported speech matters because obviously clinical approaches to psychosis and to distress know that what matters is this idea of control and power. But they rely on explicit processes such as questionnaires, interviews, and psychometric assessments that ask explicitly how much distress people feel, how in control people feel, and how powerful people feel their voices to be. Now, these explicit processes rely both on voice hearers' conscious awareness of these aspects of their experience and on their willingness to disclose them. At the same time, it is quite well established that voices are experienced as social actors, and so the people experience them in a relational way, in the same way that you experience relationships with people that others can also perceive around you. And in a much more implicit way, we know that personal relationships, which include power dynamics, are reflected and negotiated in interaction. So it's interesting to have a look at the interaction between voice hearers and their voices as a more implicit way into understanding the power dynamics involved. We don't have to ask them explicitly what the power dynamics are. We try and get at it in a different way. And the power dynamics are, of course, also implied in the way people maintain or do not maintain social harmony in interaction. And managing social harmony in interactions falls within the remits of various different frameworks. Locke and Watts call it relational work. Helen Spencer-Oty calls it rapport management. And the classic theories, Brown and Levinson, Jonathan Culpeper, would talk about it in terms of politeness and or impoliteness, depending on what we're talking about. And so we use this idea that power relationships are inherent in what we do to maintain or not maintain social harmony when we talk to each other. We apply this to reported interactions between voice hearers and their voices. And of course, I mentioned that this is not a typical data set for linguistic analysis. So what we have here is voice hearers' accounts in research interviews of what the voices have said to them. Some of these reports are more verbatim, or they're presented as direct quotes. Some of them are examples of more indirect reporting, but of course we have no access at all to what the voices have actually said. So it's an interesting testing ground for applying these kinds of linguistic frameworks. And for this presentation, I'll talk you through some of the main trends that we discovered in terms of how voices and voice hearers, but in particular voices, maintain or disrupt social harmony with the voice hearers. But I'll focus more on the sort of more interesting examples from a linguistic perspective, which are examples of what Culpeper calls implicational impoliteness, but types of implicational impoliteness that have not really been fully accounted for in the linguistics literature. And in this, we build on previous work and use these types of examples to explore how these types of impoliteness might exert power or might control voice hearers in more subtle ways, which of course can have clinical implications as well. So just to say a bit more on which sort of politeness or impoliteness framework we're using, we're sort of situating our analysis within Spencer-Oty's rapport management framework. And here, rapport management is really about how language is used to maintain or disrupt social harmony as individuals go about achieving their interactional goals. And of course, this is very much related to Brown and Levinson's classic theory of politeness. But rapport management is broader, and it allows us to account for not only instances where, in Brown and Levenson's terms, face-threatening acts are mitigated, or perhaps not, but a much broader range of interactional strategies, or in this case, rapport management orientations, where we might be giving compliments, not because we want something in return, but just for the sake of compliments. So it allows us to capture more of what actually might go on in interaction. And rapport management, like most politeness frameworks, relies on the notion of face in the same way to some extent as Brown and Levinson, but Helen Spencer-Oti goes back to the original definition, the original Goffmanian definition of face. And instead of talking about positive face and negative face, as Brown and Levinson do, Spencer-Oti talks about face and sociality rights. And so this is the idea that when we're trying to maintain social harmony is dependent on sensitivities and wants and desires that we might have, which may be threatened or bolstered in interactions. So my desire for freedom and my desire to be liked might be threatened if I'm being asked to do someone a favor that I don't want to perform. And so there are various ways of mitigating that. So Spencer-Oti breaks down this idea of face into individual identity face, relational identity face, and social identity face. And this is the idea that we are somehow invested in our own sense of self. And so our sense of worth, dignity, honor, reputation, competence. So individual identity face is about our fundamental desire for people to evaluate us positively, in particular in terms of our personal qualities. Our relational identity is sort of dependent on the concepts or the self-concept that we derive from our relationship with others, in particular significant others. So I want to be considered a good sister or a good mother. And our social identity face is very similar, but is dependent more on our social roles. So we want to be seen as good academics, for example. And in interaction, we need to mitigate. Other people have the same wants or desires, and in interaction, we need to mitigate whenever there is a threat to this, or there might be circumstances when we explicitly want to attack it or bolster it. Spencer-Oti's sociality rights are what Brown and Levinson would have called negative face, and this is really more about social expectations of appropriate behavior, fairness, mutual consideration, anything to do with contract or legal agreements, generally freedom of action within the bounds of normality. So Spencer-Oti talks about equity rights, which is about being treated fairly, not being imposed upon or exploited. And then association rights are about our rights to interact with whoever we might want to interact, so rights to involvement with others. So in interaction, all of these things can be impacted as we go about achieving our interactional goals. And I'll come back to how power is related to that in a second. But because all of these things can be impacted in interaction, Spencer-Oti talks about maintaining social harmony as a sort of result of a number of orientations or strategies, so rapport management orientations or strategies. And she describes four main ones. There might be situations when we neglect to manage rapport in a way. So there is a neglect orientation where we might impinge on somebody's face or sociality rights, but not in a way designed to attack them, and it's not perceived as an attack on them. So if I, to a very close friend of mine, say, oh, you really shouldn't see him anymore, right? I'm not sugarcoating it very much. I'm saying it as it is. It's not designed to attack. On the other hand, there are circumstances where I might be imposing myself on someone and doing quite a lot of linguistic work to mitigate any imposition on them or any threat to their face. So instead of saying, I want to see you next week, I could say, could you possibly see me sometime next week? Leaving lots of response options open for the person. Similarly, there are circumstances when you might really just want to bolster somebody's face or sociality rights. You might say to someone, that was the best curry I ever had. Or you might say to a student, you know, this is really excellent work, not because you're trying to mitigate any negative feedback that's about to come, but because that's all you have to say about it. And similarly, there are circumstances where you might explicitly want to attack or damage somebody's face or sociality rights, or something that you say may be perceived as that. For example, exclaiming to someone that you're not joking around with, "You are such an idiot." And it is this attack orientation that is most relevant to the data that we'll be looking at today. So I'll just say a little bit more about that. It's sometimes also called a challenge orientation. And basically, attack or challenge orientation in Spencer Otis terms is roughly equivalent to what Jonathan Culpepper would describe, and of course others, as impoliteness. And impoliteness, so all of these orientations are dependent and reflect power relations to some extent, because how much you need to mitigate any imposition will depend on the relative power between interlocutors. But impoliteness in particular reflects and helps to construct power relationships. There is the idea that a more powerful participant has more freedom to use fewer politeness strategies, so less of a maintenance orientation. And so they can use a neglect orientation more easily, or indeed also be impolite more easily. But impoliteness can also be a strategy to actually get or exercise power. Because when somebody's face or sociality rights are damaged, they can find themselves either forced into a reaction that they may not want to provide, or they may be forced to react in particular ways that they may not want to respond to. So people's response options can be restricted. And it has also been documented that asymmetrical patterns of impoliteness, so where you have only one interlocutor using a challenge orientation and not another, that tends to occur in situations where a more powerful individual is targeting a less powerful individual. So hopefully that makes it clear why looking at politeness and the maintenance or disruption of social harmony is relevant to the context of voice hearing, where these kinds of power dynamics are directly related to the level of distress that people might experience. So let's look at the data for a moment, what we'll be basing our analysis on. We've got 40 semi-structured research interviews with adult voice hearers who entered an early intervention service in psychosis, and this is a program in the northeast of England. We have just over 200,000 tokens in this data set. The interviews themselves were not conducted by us, so this is secondary data analysis. They were conducted by colleagues from the Hearing the Voices team to capture things like the quality of the voice hearing experience, the content, so interviewees are explicitly asked to repeat what the voices are saying to them, and some do this to a greater and some to a lesser extent. There are questions about the onset of voice hearing, the changes in the experience over time, as well as participants' beliefs and understandings about the experience. But we are interested really in the second bullet point here, which is the content of the voice hearing experience. So what do voices actually say? And we have at our disposal 841 concordance lines of reported speech. And Luke will tell you a little bit more about how we get to that. But just before I do that, I want to give you a sense of what the data is like, because I'm conscious that people may not have seen anything like this or been exposed to anything like this before. So when voice hearers describe their experiences, sometimes it can sound a little bit like this. Recently, the orange lady, who's, I describe her as like the pernicious one, she's the one who would be, if I feel down, she's the one that would sort of be in the mirror, sort of hovering there saying, you're a shit human being, you need to lose weight, or something like that, if I'm feeling quite negative anyway. She was the one that was telling me to go in front of traffic because I couldn't go because I was having a panic attack about work. And she was the one that just said, if you go, just step. All you need to is just step, you'll break a leg, you'll be in hospital, you'll be safe, I'll keep you safe. There's the purple lady, and she'd be the one that always held my hand. And ever since, she's always been the one that either, if I'm really bad or if my legs don't work, she'll be the one that'll say, "You will stop now, calm down, it's okay, I'll keep you safe, let's go home." So again, just as a reminder, we didn't transcribe these interviews, we didn't collect these interviews. So the sort of quote marks that you see and the various punctuation markers that you see were put there by the transcriber, who is not a linguist. And this will be important because it will come back in the way in which we identify these examples. But the transcriptions are verbatim, and so we are able to trust them and use them in that sense. At this point, I will hand over to Luke to tell you a little bit more about, from this kind of data set, how do we arrive at the 840 odd concordance lines of reported speech?
Thank you. Yes. Hello, everyone. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the procedures through which we utilize the corpus tools available to us to find these examples of reported speech, which as a practice, we're hoping has sort of broader applications. The value of looking for instances of speech and thought representation has been demonstrated in the realms of news discourse, for example, where you get a lot of sources being cited, or in literary studies where you get the reporting of speech for characterization. So the procedures that we outline here, as I say, we hope have kind of broader implications. And from that kind of work, again in news discourse and literature particularly, there are typologies of speech and thought representation that we can draw on. And our interest, obviously, is at the more direct end of speech representation, as we try and get a sense of the content of the auditory verbal hallucinatory experiences that our participants are involved with. For that, there are conventional ways of indicating that, particularly if you're writing it down at least. And so we can utilize those in order to help us find the examples that we're looking for. So the features that I've listed here are arguably the most commonly associated with direct speech representation: the use of inverted commas or quotation marks, the use of a reporting clause to preface the content that is attributed to another person. And you get a shift in deixis as the person telling the story or reporting the events attributes the words to a third party and then assumes their position. So we can use those as a way of finding these examples. Now, in order to target what was actually attributed to the voices, as opposed to, say, some other third party in the interviews, we were able to benefit from a procedure that we were introducing anyway for various other analytical purposes, but allowed us to target when it was the voice that was being discussed. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of what that involved. As an NLP task, this is what you might call co-reference resolution, and there are some automated tools that will enable you to do this. With the data that we have, with it being quite manageable, quite small in corpus terms, we decided to do this manually, and not least of all because of the sort of complicated dyadic construction of turns between interviewer and interviewee. Sometimes that did make it a bit of a challenge to follow the reference, which again, I would argue a manual reader is possibly better at doing. So this is an example of a passage from the data, and we can introduce our sort of conventional part of speech tagging there pretty straightforwardly. You can see where the verbs and the prepositions and the adjectives are, and our tagging of the references to the voices simply involved supplementing that with additional annotation. We just had to come up with a unique tag. We're using AVH here, just to indicate when a pronoun like they or a noun like stuff appeared to be in reference to a part of the voice hearing experience. So I did that manually. I read through and drawing on the context around from the wider interview in order to make those decisions about what was referenced to a voice. Not entirely straightforward, but it did then enable us to sort of very quickly collate all of the instances of reference to voices, which then allowed us to focus on speech reported by those voices specifically. So on the next slide, yeah, we can see the how that would be converted into the kind of core corpus queries that we were using. So in the first instance, where we can draw on transcribers using quotation marks, that's relatively straightforward for querying, particularly if they are consistent. They might use single or double quotation marks, and again, that's very easy to adapt. With transcription, there will be instances where it's not entirely certain whether something is direct or is there sort of paraphrasing, and whether the transcriber decides to use those quotation marks. But certainly that gave us a starting point for finding what we could assume were understood to be the most direct representations. In terms of a shift in DAX, since we had this annotation where we were identifying the voices, we found that when those references to the voices were using a first-person pronoun, that was indicative of the participant, the interviewee, assuming the voice of the voice here, hallucinatory experience, assuming their perspective. So if we had a tag for a pronoun like we or me or I, that was the participant assuming the point of view of the voice, and very often that would include reported speech. And then the third sort of query in our hierarchy was the use of a reporting clause. So again, looking for instances where the voice is the person doing the communicating, if you like. So looking for combinations of where we had a reference to the voice and the use of a communicative or speech verb like saying or telling or responding. And I've indicated there that we started off with a collocational span of kind of 5 tokens to the right of the tag, but it actually turned out to be fairly reliable to bring that in and bring it much more closely to the reference. You can see there as an example, just in that shift in diaxis, that there is an instance there that is not in quotation marks, but you can see that the I is one of our AVH tags, so that's spoken from the point of view of the voice. And then just to say, with the reporting clause query, there was a lot of potential for false positives. So what you would get here is a broader remit of those more indirect ways of telling, if you like. So the examples, they're saying nasty things. You would get that kind of prefacing of indirect reported speech, whether it's paraphrased by the participant or if it's a sort of general description of what was said. Which obviously started to take us away from the direct speech representation there. So we had to we did do a bit of a kind of precision and recall assessment here as well, which I'll be able to say a bit more about. Of course, these features could happen in combination. So just a brief quote here that shows we do have inverted commas. We have the quotation marks prefacing this content. It's fine. We're safe here. You've got a duvet on, etc. We do get the shift in diaxis, so the we in this example is the participant assuming the perspective of the voice, but it actually includes the participant there. And you'll see that extends to the fact that the participant then becomes the second person, so references to you are aimed back at the participant. And then we do get this reporting clause at the beginning as well, the purple lady saying. So we can see how these would combine together. So if we were to run those queries separately, we would be able to sort of collapse instances into sort of these passages here as well. So just to recap, I'm going to mention a couple of other queries that we did consider. So we've got our search for inverted commas, our shift in diaxis, and our reporting clauses. I did consider looking at the combination of the participants saying what they hear, just because there were 1 or 2 examples where that would be followed by an instance of content. So they would say something like, I would hear my name being shouted, and that at least tells us that the content is their name. But too often, again, that was used in lots of different ways, and so that was introducing a lot of noise for our queries. And then the other instance that I would sort of highlight would be when the AVH label, when the reference to the voice itself was some kind of communicative verb. So you can see sometimes it can be screaming. So this does give us an indication of what the content is when it's not lexicalized. So the participant is telling us that the content of their voice hearing experience is a scream or screaming. But that obviously has quite limited potential for us to really say much more than the fact that it is screaming. In other instances, you would get reports of it would just keep going, that word all day. So again, the participant telling us that there's particular vocabulary that characterize their experience. So what I would say is that the combination of our search for quotation marks and the first person pronoun use with those references to voices was quite successful when we tested this on a sample. Again, because we were able to compare the results from a manual search, we were able to deduce that just using those two combined searches gave us 84.5% of the passengers that we otherwise identified manually. So those passengers bring together those 840 separate instances as participants would often combine examples of direct reported speech in quick succession. Just to give a brief description of what was missed through those queries. Again, you would get a shift in day axis, but it might not involve the voice, which we tagged. It might be indicated in a shift in day axis involving the participant. So if they become the second or third person, then obviously what they're saying is this is someone else's point of view. An example here, someone describing their experience as a positive conversation, like he's going to get there, he's going to get there, he's going to meet his target. So the he in that instance is the participant themselves, and they're speaking from the point of view of their voice. And then the other instances where we had some misses was just the fact that the reference came in the questioning turn, if you like. So the interviewer would ask what kinds of things would they say. The participant, without any kind of reintroduction of the voice or any kind of reporting clause, would simply respond. So we potentially missed those examples when it belonged to in the interview turn. But ultimately, there were sort of 18 excerpts that were not captured by the query that we used based on our manual identification of those, and they came down to things like that. So that would be something to bear in mind for, again, the larger application of an automated process for finding direct reported speech. Okay, I think it's back to you.
Thanks so much, Luke. So once we had all those 840 odd instances, Luke very kindly put them into a spreadsheet for us, and that's where some more manual coding began, which was this time the coding for various rapport orientation strategies. I'm not going to go into a lot of this, just to give you a sense of how this worked, and we gave it numbers depending on how many particular instances of rapport management orientation we could find. So sometimes there would be several insults in a row, and we would consider those threats to individual identity faced and count how many there are and allocate that many to each of us. We're not doing any particular quantification, but just to get a sense of the trends. So where are the proportions in terms of what people are exposed to? So let me give you some headlines on basically what we found. We found that reported interactions between voices and voice hearers actually reflect the whole range of rapport orientations. So it's not just the case that people are experiencing attacks all the time. We also have instances of rapport enhancement orientation, where the voices would simply be complimentary, saying things like, oh, that looks good, when one of the participants was cooking something. We also have instances of rapport maintenance orientation, where the threats to face or sociality rights are mitigated. So again, Jade, somebody will say, well, can we not just walk away instead of ordering Jade to walk away? So again, response options are open. It's not something that you have to do or have to resist. There are ways around it. We found examples of a neglect orientation, where it was obvious from how the participant described something, such as the voice saying, "Go and buy this," that they didn't experience it as an attack orientation, so they didn't perceive it as impoliteness. But we did also find lots and lots of attack or challenge orientation, so impoliteness, such as Paige's voice that says, "No, you're absolutely worthless." And so, in fact, the challenge orientation or impoliteness was actually the most common in terms of the trends that we observed. And often this consisted of fairly conventional impoliteness formulae, or conventionalized impoliteness formulae, to use Jonathan's term, such as insults. "Oh, look at her, she's a stupid bitch." Challenging or unpalatable questions, such as, "Why haven't you done better?" And direct threats, "We're going to beat you, break your legs." And these are the types of examples that are well documented also in the clinical literature, and they are known to be red flags and indicative of distress. And some of the examples, these are relatively mild ones that I've put here, but some of the examples that we identified, and in particular the repetition and the frequency of them, could, in sort of pragmatics terms or in impoliteness terms, be seen as Rudanko's aggravated impoliteness. So it's extreme in intensity. And some of the examples that we noted in this work, but also in a previous data set, have a pattern, in particular the threats, that are potentially akin to some of the threats that Culpepper and et al. Noted in the context of court cases around aggravated hate speech, religiously aggravated hate speech. So that's just, that's a useful insight in itself, that kind of comparison, because it gives you a sense that the types of things that voice hearers sometimes have to hear, sometimes on a daily basis, are things that in another context are potentially criminal. So it gives you a sense of the severity of the experience in some cases. But aside from these patterns, which have been documented in lots of different data sets, we also found examples of challenge orientation that manifested in much more subtle forms of implicational impoliteness. And in fact, in cases of implicational impoliteness that aren't really accounted for in the impoliteness literature itself. And we've described these as false warnings and false reassurances, and I'll say a bit more about why we're using those terms, because obviously we're not negating the reality of the experience. It's much more about understanding how the challenge orientation itself works. And in the following examples, I'll mainly focus on examples from one participant, from Dan, but I will sort of flash additional examples from other participants just to demonstrate that the phenomena we're dealing with are not actually unique to any particular individual. So if we look at false warnings, just looking at the first example there, Dan's voice would say things like, "This is going to happen, and these people are going to die, and the house is going to be robbed, and you need to look behind you because there's someone coming with a, whatever, and everybody hates you." So these are, Kat has similar examples, the voice telling her not to go out because she's going to get killed, or Leah's voice is telling her that she's not safe where she is. So obviously, these examples look like warnings. They're about a future event that is likely to be detrimental to the person. But we can think about them as false because it is highly questionable whether the things being warned about are actually a possibility within the natural world of possibility. So let's try and unpack it in terms of, for example, a speech act, right? The speech act of warning. And speech acts carry with them sincerity and preparative conditions, which require that an individual who is making the warning believes the thing to be true. But it is tricky to apply the sincerity and preparative conditions in this case, because they require an external identity, an external entity with its own beliefs that we might be able to verify or not, and indeed that the interlocutor might be able to verify or not. And of course, the voice here is not in that position, and the voice doesn't strictly speaking, fulfill those criteria in terms of the reality that we share. It does fulfill that criteria in terms of the voice hearer's reality that they share just with the voice. So it is difficult to talk about it, and the voices have a dual status. So on the one hand, they're perceived as separate social agents, and they are sometimes attributed their own beliefs, motivations, and knowledge. On the other hand, actually many of the voice hearers also recognize them as something that comes from themselves. And so as I mentioned, we don't have access to the voices. We only have the voice hearer's report of the voices. At the same time, as an outsider, we can see that the things being warned about are likely to happen in the shared physical world. So in that sense, they might break the maximum of quality. And the voice hearer also sometimes recognizes this duality, and that's crucial for us to be able to talk about these in terms of potential falseness. So they recognize that the voice might be coming from them, and they do recognize that there might be something going on in terms of this not being a straightforward warning, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. But I think it's also worth just saying why on earth would we consider this to be an example of impoliteness or an attack orientation, because it's not a prototypical example. But you can think about it as impoliteness in terms of the fact that that the claims here, the warnings here, undermine the person's relationship with others. So they make them fearful of other people. They attack their freedom of action because it means that that voice hearers are potentially made to leave places, to stay at home, to not go out. So it's impoliteness in the sense that the warnings, the effect of the warnings, is detrimental to the interviewees themselves. And again, this is something that the voice hearers recognize. So Dan, in particular, of these types of examples, says, when it happens, I think, oh, you know, they're helping me to stop this plot and stuff. So here, this idea that they believe the warning as it is. But then I'm like, this is really just making me paranoid. It's making me unhappy. It's making me ill. So they're recognizing the negative effects on them. And they end up also sometimes questioning whether what the voices are saying are real or can come to some kind of fruition. But the ambivalence here is important. So the duality and the ambivalence is important. It means that the person is kind of hooked. There is a sense that on the one hand, the voices might be doing something good for them. They might be protecting them, right? They might be helping them to stop this plot. And if you think about the sort of this idea that we have to be somehow reciprocal in our interactions, then if I think that someone is doing something good for me, it's very hard for me to resist that and say, oh, no, what you're saying doesn't make any sense. That's not right, right? So it's very difficult to resist and push away, which potentially means that the voice might have more control over them because of the subtleties, because of this duality. They're very much harder to push away and question in a way. Moving on to false reassurances and promises. These are very similar. So again, as speech acts, reassurances and promises tend to bolster people's sense of self and increase the sense that the voice wants what's good for the person. Excuse me for a second, I've got a frog in my throat. So again, with Dan's voices, we've got examples like, let's spend all the money in our bank account because that's going to make everything better. Or Dan's voice saying something like, if you get your, if you take your belt and you hit yourself with it, you'll feel better and you'll be punished for what you've done and everything will be okay. Or again, Dan's voice saying, you can trust me. It will say stuff like, I know you'll always come back to me. So there's this idea that, again, the reassurances and promises are sort of false in the same way to the false warnings, that especially in the long run, none of these things are actually going to be good for the person or make them feel better. So again, we have issues with the sincerity condition and the quality maxim here as well. The suggested activities risk harm to the voice hearer. And there is, again, an exertion of power over the person by directing their actions while also claiming to be trustworthy and on their side at the same time. So in some ways, these are the opposite to the false warning examples, because there the person is forced into a behavior that's overly cautious, whereas here they're sort of being encouraged into behavior that's potentially overly callous. But in the same way that the speech act of a warning creates a credit on the part of the person issuing them, the claims to trustworthiness and the claims to "you can trust me, everything will be okay" create a credit on the side of the voice, thereby potentially, again, restricting people's response options. So behaving in the same way that conventionalized impoliteness might be. That people just don't have the option of as easily saying, "No, go away, you're an idiot, leave me alone." Because the voice is perceived as potentially trying to do something good for them. And the ambivalence around this, again, is evident from some of the meta-commentary that the participants volunteer. So Dan says of these types of examples, it's not nice, but at the same time, I do feel quite, oh, it's trying to help me. Combined with recognition that, oh, they're quite manipulative and two-faced, like duplicitous. And comments like, so I'm in sort of this conflict because I want to think, I'm stressed, it's not real. But then on the other half of me is like, it is. So there is this constant back and forth, this constant recognition that there might be something going on. There's a sense in which these warnings and reassurances are real and they're important and they're designed to help me. But on the other hand, this questioning of whether this is real and recognizing both the negative impact, long-term or short-term, on them, and also this idea that the voices might be manipulative or duplicitous. But because of the ambivalence, again, these are harder to recognize and potentially tackle. And so again, just a few more examples to show you that we have this with other participants as well, such as with Eric and with Orla and with Ryan. So explicit claims to being on your side, to being here for you, to getting you out of this. And a similar meta-commentary from these participants as well. So she can be okay and seem like a nice person. There's another motive underneath it. She's just got a lot of power. She's a bully. So explicit recognition that perhaps all isn't the way it seems on the surface. And so let's just finish with some reflections, and hopefully that will leave us a bit of time for questions. So we know from previous literature that impoliteness can be a strategy to get or exercise power. But we don't really know how the effects vary when the impoliteness is more subtle, more hidden, more ambivalent, not necessarily as easily classed as impoliteness in the first place. And then this is kind of more of a reflection in terms of politeness theory. There is a sense that politeness theory or impoliteness theory relies very much on participants, so on the addressees' evaluations of what is impolite or not. So if the addressee says, "I've been offended," then it almost automatically counts as impoliteness. But the examples that I just talked about do sort of question to what extent we can really rely on participants' own evaluations of impoliteness exclusively. So there might be just other things that we need to take into consideration. Now, throughout the discussion of the examples, we've sort of hypothesized that these more subtle examples are perhaps more difficult to recognize and resist, and therefore more difficult to address in therapeutic contexts. And we can definitely see evidence in the meta-commentary that they create an inner conflict. But we don't actually know very well what this is a result of. Is this a result of an element of reciprocity that's inherent in sort of interactional relationships, that if I compliment you, you kind of feel an obligation to compliment me, or if I insult you, there's more likely to be an insult back, which of course is well documented? Or is it perhaps a result of something like trust that's built up over time? Because of course these relationships with voices tend to take place over long periods of time. They're not isolated experiences. And so is it a case that with the use of enhancement orientation, sometimes there is a trust that gets built up, and which actually then may exacerbate the effect of any attack, like explicit attack, explicit impoliteness that does come, because you're then being attacked by a person or an entity that you've come to trust and you've come to rely on. There is also this idea, this element that the combination of trust me, I'm on your side, so these enhancement orientation type utterances, combined with both with more explicit impoliteness, but also with this idea that in the long run, the activities that are being suggested or suggested to avoid tend to undermine the person and tend to undermine the person's relationship with others. That particular pattern seems to mirror the engagement strategy that's used in the context of online grooming, which we've seen research come out of. Which again, for a therapeutic context, potentially has interesting implications, because there are therapies in place that can be used to help victims of online grooming. And is there some way that those might be useful in the context of the treatment of voice hearing for people who are distressed and seek help? And obviously, a lot of this relies on some kind of systematic way of identifying all the types of things that the voices might say, which isn't restricted by sort of known strategies, so known impoliteness or known commands that we would be looking for. So things like quote marks and reporting clauses that are sort of independent of the content of what then follows, because that's the only way that we would even notice these in a large data set. So that's all I sort of wanted to say today. I hope that at least some of that was interesting and relevant, and I look forward to your questions. And I realized I hadn't turned my camera back on. Sorry about that. Hi.
No, thank you very much. So I've been looking forward to this talk all term, so I am quite happy to start off the questions for today. I don't know if whether the participants were clinical, would class themselves as clinical or non-clinical, was available to you. Was that available to you?
They were all part of the early intervention in psychosis service, which is a clinical intervention. So they were all clinical participants, yes.
Okay. As be comorbid with other mental illnesses, was there any, would it be worthwhile or interesting to sort of see if there's a difference between people who just experience voice hearing and people who experience voice hearing and another comorbid mental illness alongside that? And do you think there might be a distinction that might be worth investigating there?
We don't have that information at our disposal because these participants were not selected on the basis of diagnosis, but on the basis of being part of this particular service. In a different study, in a previous study, we had a bit more information on participants, not so much about other illnesses, but we were able to compare and contrast our sort of more linguistic findings, which are similar to some of these, with participant scores on the CRS questionnaire and participant scores on various instruments that measure levels of anxiety and levels of depression. And there we did find, I mean, it was a much smaller data set, it was just 10 interviews, but we did find that the participants who had who experienced the types of utterances that we would have described as potentially most distressing were actually also the participants who scored highest on some of these measures of anxiety and depression. So there is definitely something to explore there, but we just don't have the data or the sort of complementary data with this particular group of participants.
Yeah, of course. Okay, I'm just going to stop the recording now.